Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the Soldier, who came back from the dead, a tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant investigative mind. But before that, I want to say, you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Grab your coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Soldier's Return. The rain was relentless, a torrential downpour that beat against the windows of the stately townhouse as Hercule Poirot arrived, a small figure dressed with impeccable neatness in his dark suit, his shoes tapping the stone steps with a steady rhythm. The night was heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth, and the sky had a charcoal-grey pallor that seemed to stretch on forever. The world outside the grand residence was drowned in shadows and water, but within, the warmth and flickering glow of oil lamps made the air seem more alive. Poirot's cab had driven him through the winding streets of London to the address Colonel Richard Carlyle had given him, a place of quiet luxury nestled in one of the city's more exclusive districts. As he made his way up the front steps, he was greeted by a butler who took his hat and coat with a quiet efficiency before leading him into the heart of the house. The drawing-room was a masterpiece of the grand British style. Dark oak panelling, rich tapestries, and an elaborate chandelier that hung from the ceiling as though suspended by the very weight of tradition. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished floor. "Ah, mon ami," said Colonel Carlyle, his voice booming as he rose from his armchair. The Colonel was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his neatly trimmed moustache twitching as he extended his hand to Poirot in the same eager, almost theatrical way that he always did. Carlyle's uniform, though faded, still carried the airs of someone who had once commanded respect on the battlefield. "Colonel Carlyle," Poirot replied, his accent clipped and formal. He gave a small, polite bow. "It is always a pleasure to be in the company of such distinguished hosts." The Colonel smiled, his eyes flickering toward the guests who were scattered across the room, men and women engaged in murmured conversation. Some were gathered in front of the fire, others by the large windows that overlooked the rain-soaked garden. "You must forgive the modest gathering," Carlyle said, turning toward the others. "We are celebrating the return of an old friend, a comrade, a hero, a man who defied all expectations, Captain James Westfield." At the mention of the name, the room fell momentarily still. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the faces of the other guests. There were nods and murmurs of approval, some of mild surprise, others tinged with uncertainty. It was clear the captain's return was a source of both joy and perhaps unease. Poirot's gaze moved across the room, and it didn't take long for him to spot the man in question. Captain Westfield stood near the window, his face pale, almost ghostly, under the light. He was dressed in a simple black suit, but there was something about him, a stillness, an odd sense of detachment. His eyes were wide, but they seemed vacant, as though he was watching something far beyond the room, lost in some distant thought. The man's face was handsome, yet there was a hollowness to it, as if his very soul had been stripped away in the years he had spent away from the world. His expression was one of calm, almost unnatural calm, but Poirot's little grey cells were already at work, sifting through the first impressions, drawing out the inconsistencies. A man who had been dead for 3 years should have more than a ghost of a smile, no? "Ah, Captain Westfield," Poirot murmured under his breath, but loud enough for the Colonel to hear. "A most remarkable reunion, a man returned from the grave. The colonel laughed heartily, a laugh that seemed a touch too loud, as though he were overcompensating for something. "Indeed, a miracle, Poirot, a miracle, mon ami. To think of it, 3 years we thought him gone, never recovered from the trenches. But here he is, returned to us in the flesh. A living legend." Poirot nodded politely, though he was far from convinced. His eyes narrowed slightly as he observed the captain's movements. Westfield was not interacting with anyone in particular. He merely stood there, his gaze fixed. The faintest tremor ran through Poirot's mind. There was something not quite right about the man's return. But what? "Come, Poirot," Carlyle continued, leading him further into the room. "Let us introduce you properly." As they approached, Westfield finally turned his gaze toward them. His eyes locked with Poirot's, and for a moment there was a flicker, a brief instant when Poirot could have sworn that the captain's calmness gave way to something darker, something deeper. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Westfield said, his voice low and strangely neutral. "A pleasure to meet you at last." Poirot studied him closely, a slight frown playing at the corner of his lips. "The pleasure is mine, Captain. It is not every day that—" "One meets a man returned from the dead." Westfield gave a thin smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "Yes, not every day." A subtle tension hummed in the air, palpable to those who could sense it. Poirot was struck by the peculiar nature of Westfield's response. It was as though he were saying words he had rehearsed rather than expressing any true sentiment. There was something mechanical about his behavior, something missing. Carlyle, sensing the unease, clapped his hands together. "Well, well, let us toast to the return of our brave soldier." He raised his glass with a flourish, and the others followed suit, some more enthusiastically than others. But Poirot's mind was elsewhere, spinning with possibilities. He could hear Carlyle's booming voice in the background, but his attention was fixed on Captain Westfield, whose eyes now seemed fixed on a spot somewhere in the distance, as though he were lost in thought. And then, just as Poirot was about to ask a question, Colonel Carlyle leaned in close, lowering his voice. "You know, Poirot, there's more to this than meets the eye. There is unfinished business, you could say, from the war, something that still hangs in the air." Poirot's brow furrowed. The colonel's words were vague, but they were enough to stir a deep curiosity within him. What could the colonel mean by unfinished business? And why did it seem that every person in the room had the same uneasy smile when speaking of Westfield? Before Poirot could inquire further, a servant came in with more wine, and the evening's conversation resumed. But Poirot's mind was already racing, tracing lines, connecting dots, and beginning to unravel the threads that were already tying this evening together. As the guests conversed and laughed, Poirot stood apart, watching. The faint sound of raindrops outside was drowned out by the chatter, but within him the first pieces of a puzzle were beginning to click into place. The return of Captain Westfield was no miracle. It was a mystery, one that would require all of Poirot's little grey cells to solve. The captain's strange calm, the colonel's cryptic remark, the hushed conversations. There was much more to this gathering than met the eye, and Poirot, ever the observer, would not rest until the truth was revealed. As the evening wore on, Poirot's suspicions only deepened. He had already begun to suspect that the soldier's return was no coincidence, and that the answer, when it came, would be something far darker than anyone could anticipate. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere, in the midst of the fine china, the clinking of glasses, and the pretentious laughter, a secret waited, one that Hercule Poirot was determined to uncover. Chapter 2. A Dreadful Discovery, the morning following the dinner at Colonel. Richard Carlyle's estate was grey and damp, as though the sky itself had absorbed the heaviness of the previous evening's events. The rain had not relented, but the storm had mellowed into a persistent drizzle that clung to the windows and left the air thick with a damp chill. Hercule Poirot stood by the window of his temporary bedroom, watching the droplets race down the glass. His thoughts, however, were far from the weather outside. He had not been able to shake the peculiarities of Captain James Westfield's reappearance. The man's unsettling calm, his disjointed responses, and the Colonel's cryptic words about unfinished business. These fragments had lodged themselves firmly in Poirot's mind. There was something beneath the surface, something that was not quite right, and Poirot, as ever, was determined to uncover it. He had risen early, as was his custom, to enjoy a brief moment of solitude and reflection before the day's inevitable
complications. He was savouring a quiet breakfast when the door to his room suddenly opened, revealing a servant, her face pale with panic. "Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, her breath coming in short bursts. "There's been a dreadful discovery. Captain Westfield, he is dead."
Poirot did not rise immediately, nor did he speak. Instead, he calmly placed his cup of coffee down and nodded slowly. His mind was already forming the question that would drive his investigation. "How? Dead?" Poirot asked, his voice quiet, but authoritative. "But he was well only hours ago. A miracle indeed it seemed, that he walked among us, and now this." The servant trembled, clearly shaken. "Yes, monsieur, they found him this morning in his room. Murdered, they
say. A terrible scene. Colonel Carlyle he is quite beside himself."
"He's requested you, sir, to come immediately." Poirot rose to his feet with deliberate slowness. There was no trace of surprise or distress on his face, only that calm determination that was so characteristic of him. With a small nod, he followed the servant down the grand hallway toward the stairs leading up to the second floor. The house was eerily quiet at this hour, the only sounds being the soft tread of Poirot's shoes and the occasional creak of the old house settling. When they reached the captain's room, the door was ajar, and Colonel Carlyle stood just outside, his face a portrait of disarray. He had removed his jacket, and his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, an uncommon disheveledness for the otherwise proud officer. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his gaze, red-rimmed from lack of sleep, was distant, as though he was still processing what had occurred. "Poirot," he greeted the detective with a strained, almost desperate voice.
"Thank you for coming. I don't know what to think. It's all so strange. I thought—" He broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Poirot simply raised a hand, his expression calm, composed. "I will take a look, Colonel. We must see the body. What do the police say?" The Colonel nodded numbly. "They're still inside, trying to make sense of it all, but it doesn't look like anything but a violent attack."
"They've no idea who could have done it." "No signs of a break-in, no robbery, nothing." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "We shall see." The Colonel stepped aside, allowing Poirot entry into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint scent of cologne. The room itself, elegant and neatly furnished, looked little different from how it had been the evening before. The bed was undisturbed, the drapes still drawn shut. Yet, there in the centre of the room, the body of Captain James Westfield lay sprawled on the floor, his face twisted in a grimace that spoke of violent struggle. Poirot stepped forward, carefully observing the scene. The body was lying in a pool of blood, but it was clear that Westfield had not died instantly. His hands were clenched into tight fists, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he had been gasping for breath in his final moments. His clothes, though neat, were torn at the cuffs, as if he had been fighting someone off. Poirot crouched next to the body, taking in every detail with his usual precision. "The struggle, Colonel. It was a violent one, yes?" Poirot's voice was calm, but filled with authority. "Look at the clenched fists, the blood under his nail." He fought back. "Whoever did this, they were not subtle." The Colonel nodded, his expression grim. "It certainly looks that way. But why would anyone attack him? He was a hero. The soldiers he fought with loved him. The people here, well, we all held him in high regard." Poirot glanced at the bed, then slowly turned his eyes to the small wooden desk in the corner of the room. "You are right, Colonel. There is no apparent reason for someone to kill him. But let us not forget, this is a case of a man who should not have been here at all. His return is a mystery in itself." Poirot's gaze moved to the floor, and he leaned in closer to the bloodstains, noting the marks left in the carpet. His eyes flickered over a small detail, the captain's boots. The soles were covered in dirt, a dark, clinging mud that seemed out of place in the otherwise clean room. The carpet, the furniture, and even the window sills were immaculate. No sign of anything being disturbed. But the boots? "Aha," Poirot muttered softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "This, mon ami, is very curious." Colonel Carlyle, clearly unaware of the significance, peered over his shoulder. "What
Is it, Poirot?"
Poirot pointed to the boot. "A smudge of dirt, Colonel, on the sole. It is not what one would expect from a man who has just awoken in his room. And it is not consistent with the rest of the room's cleanliness." The Colonel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Poirot rose from his crouch, his eyes scanning the room one last time before fixing on the Colonel. "I mean that Captain Westfield did not simply wake up and find himself dead. There is something more to this." Before the Colonel could respond, Poirot turned his attention back to the body, noting that the captain's military jacket was neatly draped over a nearby chair, untouched, and his watch was still on his wrist. It was as if Westfield had been preparing for something, perhaps even an evening out, before something or someone interrupted him. Poirot's mind began to churn. "Tell me, Colonel, did you and Captain Westfield speak at all this morning before his untimely death?" The Colonel hesitated, his eyes flicking to the floor. "No, not directly. We all came downstairs together for breakfast, but he was—"
"Well, quiet. He barely said anything at all, just sat there, staring at his food. It was unnerving, but no, I didn't speak with him alone." Poirot's eyes narrowed. There were threads here, unseen and hidden. Who was Westfield, truly? And
What was he hiding? "Very well, Colonel, I will need to speak with everyone who was here last night. For now, I must ask, did anyone see anything unusual after the dinner last night? Did Captain Westfield leave the house at any point? Any unusual visitors?" The Colonel shook his head. "Not that I know of. He retired to his room early, as far as I'm aware. No one saw him after that." Poirot turned to leave, but as he stepped toward the door, something caught his eye, a small item tucked under the chair, half hidden by the rug. He knelt again, carefully retrieving it, a torn letter, crumpled and nearly unreadable. It was partially damp from the rain, but Poirot could just make out the faint imprint of writing. "Ah," he muttered under his breath, "this, I suspect, will tell us something crucial." As Poirot turned to leave, his mind was already piecing together the puzzle. The dirt on the boots, the strange behavior of Westfield, the torn letter, each was a clue leading him toward a truth he could not yet fully see. But Poirot was confident of one thing: this was no ordinary case, and the sooner he understood the true nature of Captain Westfield's return, the closer he would come to unraveling the mystery that lay hidden beneath the surface. The Colonel's voice called after him. "Poirot, do you think we'll ever know the truth?" Poirot paused at the door, his back turned, but he spoke with unwavering certainty. "Truth, Colonel, is often elusive, but in the end it is always revealed. And when it does, the consequences are never what we expect." Chapter 3. The Silent Witnesses. The drawing-room at Carlyle's estate, despite its grandeur, felt uncomfortably stifling that morning. The same heavy curtains that had hung the evening before now seemed to trap the low, dreary light of a morning that had not yet fully shaken off the remnants of last night's storm. The rain, though less fierce, continued to fall, giving the estate an air of somberness that matched the mood inside. Hercule Poirot sat opposite Colonel Richard Carlyle, his gaze steady and observant. The Colonel, who had once seemed the epitome of a calm and composed military man, now appeared unmoored, his brow furrowed, eyes darting restlessly about the room. He gripped a glass of brandy in one hand, though his movements were mechanical, as though he were not fully aware of what he was doing. Poirot's mind was sharp, as it always was, dissecting the situation with the precision of a scalpel. The Colonel's discomfort was palpable, yet Poirot knew that his true task now was to extract the information necessary to illuminate the path ahead. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the silence, marking the passing moments with relentless inevitability. "Colonel," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tense stillness, "I must ask you once again, can you think of anyone, any circumstance that might have led to Captain Westfield's death? You said last night that he had no enemies, no reason to fear, yet now he is dead in the most violent of ways." Colonel exhaled heavily, his gaze dropping to his glass. He set it down on the nearby table with a sudden force, the sharp clink of glass breaking through the quiet. "I told you, Poirot. Westfield had no enemies," he replied, his voice tight with frustration. "He was a good man, a soldier, a hero for God's sake. Everyone who knew him respected him. There was nothing, no reason." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he studied the Colonel's face, noting the strain around his eyes and the tightness in his jaw. "But you are troubled, Colonel. You are not convinced of your own words. Why?" Colonel Carlyle's hand instinctively reached for the brandy glass again, but he paused before touching it. A flicker of unease passed over his features before he gave a slow, measured sigh. "There's nothing to say, Poirot. I told you everything last night. The man's return was miraculous enough. And then this death, it's all too much." His voice wavered, betraying an emotion Poirot had not yet seen. Guilt, perhaps, or something deeper. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his small, purposeful hands folding neatly in his lap. "I believe you are not telling me everything, Colonel. There is something you are withholding. Perhaps it is something you do not wish to admit even to yourself." The Colonel stiffened. His eyes flashed with a brief, fleeting intensity before he glanced away. Poirot caught it instantly. A subtle shift in posture, a momentary betraying flicker of a suppressed emotion. "You misunderstand me," the Colonel muttered, his voice low and controlled. "I've nothing to hide." Poirot, however, was not so easily dismissed. His eyes fell on the Colonel's right hand, which rested on the arm of the chair. There, just above the wrist, was a small scar, barely visible but distinct in the dim light. It was old, but the skin around it was slightly reddened, as if it had been irritated recently. Poirot's mind immediately snapped into focus. "A recent injury, Colonel?" Poirot asked, his voice casual, though every word carried weight.
Struggle, perhaps." The Colonel's hand moved as though to conceal the scar, but Poirot had already seen enough.
The Colonel's expression tightened for a brief moment, before he smiled, though the smile did not quite reach his eyes. "Nothing of importance," he said quickly, his words too sharp. "A minor accident, a scrape, that's all." Poirot did not pursue the matter further, though the Colonel's sudden defensiveness left him pondering the nature of that injury. It was an inconsequential detail in isolation, but it fit the pattern of the evening's events. Small, telling clues, each pointing in different directions, but all conspiring to hide the truth. Before Poirot could continue his questioning, there was a soft knock at the door. A servant, Miss Lambert, entered, her face pale and strained, her expression apologetic. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice a whisper of uncertainty. "I thought you should know there's something more that I discovered."
"Something I didn't mention before?" Poirot raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Please, Miss Lambert, what is it?"
The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but she spoke with quiet urgency. "Last night, after dinner, I saw a figure. A man standing near the edge of the estate. He was just lurking, watching." Poirot's interest piqued. "A figure? What did he look like? Did you recognize him?" Miss Lambert's eyes flickered toward Colonel Carlyle, as if uncertain how much to reveal in his presence. The Colonel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze dropping to the floor. Poirot watched this exchange carefully, his suspicions deepening. "I didn't recognize him," she continued, her voice low. "He was tall, but I couldn't see his face clearly. He was wearing a long coat, and the rain, it was hard to make out anything. But he was there. For a while. I thought I heard footsteps later, but when I went out, he was gone." Poirot gave a small, contemplative nod. "A shadowy figure," he murmured to himself. "Indeed, very curious."
"And what time was this?" "I'm not sure," Miss Lambert admitted, her voice faltering.
"Maybe just after dinner. Perhaps around 9 or 10. It was late, but the figure stood there, almost as if waiting for something." Poirot stood abruptly, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Miss Lambert. You have been most helpful. I will need to speak with you more later." As she exited the room, Poirot turned to the Colonel. "Colonel Carlyle, this shadowy figure, could it be someone you recognize? Perhaps someone with a reason to be near your estate?" The Colonel shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No, Poirot, I don't know anyone like that. And I certainly don't know why anyone would be lurking around here." Poirot's mind was already working, piecing together the small fragments of information. The scar, the shadowy figure, the mention of a mysterious person. It all fit into a puzzle. That was still unclear, but the edges were starting to take shape. He felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on him, but he was patient. He would not rush. His little grey cells had begun to hum with a quiet, steady rhythm, and Poirot knew that the truth, though hidden, was close at hand. Poirot turned toward the side table where the Colonel had placed some papers earlier. He scanned the scattered letters, stopping when one caught his attention. A letter written in French, dated just 3 days before Captain Westfield's death. It was a thin piece of correspondence, its edges slightly frayed, and it seemed to have been hastily folded and placed among other items in the captain's personal belongings. This, Poirot said, his voice calm yet sharp with purpose. A letter from a French woman. Very recent. He opened the letter with care, unfolding it gently. His eyes scanned the neat handwriting. Ah, it speaks of an urgent matter. I have news for you, it says. Come to me quickly. Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. Who is this woman, and what news does she have? And more importantly, why was Captain Westfield in possession of this letter? He handed the letter to the Colonel, who took it with a disinterested air, though Poirot noted a subtle shift in his demeanour. His lips pressed together briefly before he spoke. I don't know anything about it, the Colonel said flatly. Perhaps a lover from the past? I don't know, Poirot. This is all too much. Poirot did not miss the hesitation in the Colonel's voice. He had heard enough. The pieces were aligning, but the puzzle remained stubbornly incomplete. Very well, Colonel. I will begin my inquiries with Miss Lambert and the other servants, but I must also speak with your household staff in greater detail. We will uncover the truth bit by bit, and you will see no stone shall be left unturned. As Poirot prepared to leave the room, his mind still turning over the pieces of the puzzle, he was certain of one thing. The answers would come soon. And when they did, they would be both unexpected and undeniable. Chapter 4. The French Letter. Poirot's office, nestled in a quiet corner of London, was exactly as it always was, a sanctuary of order and method. The soft tick of the clock on the wall was the only sound that punctuated the otherwise still air, save for the occasional murmur of his trusted friend, Captain Hastings, as he leaned back in his chair, reading through the latest batch of newspaper clippings. Poirot sat at his desk, the French letter in front of him, his fingers carefully tracing the delicate edges of the paper. The scent of ink, paper, and dust lingered in the air, a familiar presence that comforted him. The letter itself, however, was far from comforting. The cryptic words written on it seemed to whisper of mysteries far more intricate than anyone could have anticipated. The words, though elegant and precise, were wrapped in ambiguity, hinting at something hidden, something unresolved. Hastings, ever the eager observer, watched Poirot intently, but he was clearly struggling to follow his friend's train of thought. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" Hastings asked, the curiosity clear in his voice. Poirot leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together in front of him. His sharp eyes scanned the letter again, reading the words with an intensity that might have unnerved someone less familiar with his methods. "It is an odd thing, Hastings," Poirot began, his voice low and thoughtful. "A letter, so succinct,
yet laden with implications. Listen to the words, mon ami. I have news for you. Come quickly, for there is a debt to be paid, an unfinished matter that must be resolved.
Time is of the essence." He paused, rubbing his fingers together as though savouring the feel of the paper, before continuing. "A debt. Unfinished. What does that tell you?" Hastings scratched his chin, his brow furrowing. "Well, it sounds like someone wants to settle an old score, doesn't it? But it's all rather vague." "Indeed," Poirot replied, his expression momentarily distant. "Vague, yes, but very deliberate, I think. The writer wants to convey urgency without revealing too much, perhaps because they do not want to be discovered. But why would Captain Westfield have kept this letter? Was he meeting with someone from his past?" Poirot looked up from the letter, his gaze sharp and precise. "That is the question. Hastings, why would Captain Westfield, presumed dead, receive such a letter?
And more importantly, why would he return after all this time for an unfinished matter? Hastings shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowed in concentration. You think this could have something to do with his return? Maybe he wasn't.
The same man who left for the war? Poirot nodded, his lips pressing together. Perhaps, yes. It is possible that Westfield's return had little to do with reconciliation or familial duties.
It may have been about something far darker, something that he had to uncover, or perhaps something that he feared had remained unresolved. A debt to be paid, but paid by whom? Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. And the unfinished
matter? What do you think that could be? Poirot shook his head slowly. It is too soon to tell. But the phrase is too specific to be ignored. Something important was left undone, Hastings, and Westfield's return was not the gesture
of a simple man coming home.
It was the return of someone with an agenda. There was a moment of silence as Poirot fell into deep thought, his eyes tracing the elegant handwriting. His mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. He ran, his fingers over the back of the letter again, the lightest touch, and froze. Mon Dieu, he murmured, a spark of realization flashing in his eyes. Hastings, startled, leaned in closer. What is it, Poirot? Poirot held up the letter, pointing to something small but significant, a faintly penciled address, written in a cramped hand on the back of the paper. Hastings squinted at it. Paris, Poirot said, his voice cool and measured. A place in Paris. Hastings leaned closer. Do you think this address is connected to the letter, Poirot? To Captain Westfield? Poirot nodded slowly, his lips forming a thin line. I do. This address is a clue, perhaps the key. Someone in Paris has knowledge of what has transpired. Someone who is waiting for Westfield. Or perhaps someone who wanted him to return. A French connection, Hastings muttered, his mind beginning to race. You think someone from his past in France, maybe from the war, could be involved? Poirot glanced at his companion, his gaze calculating. It is possible, very possible. Westfield's past in France, his presumed death, and now this letter, are all pieces of a puzzle that demand attention, but we must be cautious.
Hastings, the game is far from over. Poirot stood abruptly, placing the letter carefully in an envelope. He turned to Hastings, who had risen from his chair, eager to follow his every move. Come, mon ami, Poirot said, his voice taking
on that familiar air of purpose. We must find this address. We must go to Paris. But before we do, we must gather more information. There are more questions that need to be answered, and the truth will only reveal itself when we pull on the right threads. Hastings, as always, was ready to follow wherever Poirot led. Do you think this unfinished debt is the key to Westfield's return, Poirot? Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing in concentration. I believe it is. But it is not the only key. There is something more. A hidden truth. And if we are to uncover it, we must look deeper. Westfield's return was not a mere coincidence. And now there is someone, or something, that he has been seeking. We must be clever. Hastings nodded, the excitement of the case beginning to override his earlier confusion. Paris, then? But how do we even know where to start? Poirot's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. We begin with the letter. We shall speak to the one who wrote it, or at least to the one who knows of it. And we shall use our little grey cells to guide us. The two men exchanged a glance, a moment of quiet understanding passing between them. Poirot was already immersed in his thoughts, his mind racing as he pieced together the new clues. A letter, an address in Paris, and the shadow of an unfinished debt, these were the strands that would lead them to the heart of the mystery. And as they prepared to leave the office, Poirot's mind shifted toward the psychological aspect of the case. It was clear to him now that this was no simple mystery. Westfield's return, the letter, the cryptic words, the debt, these were not isolated events. They were connected by the unseen threads of guilt, ambition, and secrecy. But what, precisely, was the man seeking? And what price would he have to pay to uncover the truth? These questions would guide Poirot on his next steps, and as always, he was determined to find the answers. Chapter 5. The shadow of war. The streets of Paris had not changed since the last time Poirot had visited. The cobblestones were still slick, with rain, and the quiet hum of the city seemed to carry an air of mystery. It was the kind of evening that seemed ripe for secrets to unfold, and Poirot had no intention of letting any slip away unnoticed. His sharp eyes moved constantly, observing the smallest of details, an overturned umbrella, the flick of a shadow between two buildings, the hurried steps of pedestrians seeking shelter from the growing chill. He and Hastings had arrived at a small café tucked in a quiet corner of Montparnasse, one that had served as a meeting point for many soldiers during the war. It was here, in this humble establishment, that they would begin to unravel the tangled web of Captain James Westfield's past. The café's owner, an elderly woman named Madame Dubois, had agreed to meet them, her wrinkled hand steady as she poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups. She had known Westfield well during his time in Paris, and while her memories were a little hazy, she had promised to speak of him honestly. Poirot sat across from Madame Dubois, his fingers steepled in front of him. He listened closely to every word she spoke, carefully noting every nuance in her tone. Hastings, sitting beside him, was content to remain quiet, though his curiosity was evident as he observed the exchange with great interest. "Ah, Captain Westfield," Madame Dubois began, her voice wistful as she poured the coffee.
He was a fine young man, but there was something different about him after the war. Before, he was always lively, so full of promise. But after, well, the war changes people, doesn't it? Poirot nodded, his mind already racing. Yes, indeed, madame. The war changes us all.
"Tell me, what do you remember of him? Was there anything unusual about him during his time here in Paris?" She glanced down at her hands, rubbing her fingers together as though she were recalling something distant. He was quiet, more than
he should have been. He would often sit in the corner, staring out the window, but he always paid his bills on time, always polite. A good man until one night.
Poirot's eyes sharpened, and he leaned forward slightly. "One night, madame? What happened that night?" Madame Dubois hesitated, her eyes flickering with a trace of fear. "It was a late evening. There was a group of officers, his comrades, who
came in talking in low voices. They seemed agitated, and there was a lot of tension in the air. Westfield didn't speak much, but I noticed him looking at them strangely. His face was pale, like he had seen a ghost. Was it something
specific that worried him, do you think?" Hastings asked, his voice low. She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "He seemed haunted. That's the best way I can put it. He didn't tell me everything, of course. I wouldn't expect him to. But I remember him saying something about unfinished business, something that had been left behind. It sounded dangerous." Poirot's brow furrowed as he processed the words. Unfinished business, he murmured to himself. The same words from the letter. Madame Dubois glanced at him, surprised. What letter? Poirot smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. A letter was found among Captain Westfield's effects. It spoke of an unfinished matter, something he needed to resolve. The cafe owner shifted in her chair, uneasy. I didn't know about that, but I do remember something else. She looked around to ensure no one was listening, and then leaned in closer. There were rumors, you see, about a secret operation, a mission that went wrong during the war. Some of the men died, no one really knew why, but Westfield. He came back to Paris after the war, alone, none of the others. Poirot's mind was already racing. A covert operation, you say? And what of the others involved in this mission? Madame Dubois' eyes lowered. I don't know much, but there were whispers of betrayal. A comrade who turned on them. It's all so vague now, but I remember someone saying that Westfield had been changed by it. He was the only one who returned. The others were left behind, buried in the mud of the trenches. A sense of foreboding crept over Poirot as he processed the information. A secret mission, a betrayal, unfinished business. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they didn't yet form a clear picture. There were so many questions, questions that he suspected would not be answered easily. He stood up, his movements deliberate. Thank you, madame. You have been most helpful. You have given me much to consider. Hastings followed him as he made his way toward the door, but before they could step into the street, Poirot turned back to the elderly woman. One more thing, Madame Dubois. Do you know anything of a fellow officer, a man who may have been close to Captain Westfield during the war? Someone who might have known more about this betrayal? She looked startled, then thoughtful. There was one man. His name was Captain Moreau. He was one of Westfield's closest comrades. But he died shortly after the war ended. There were rumors about him too. Some said he had been involved in something shady, but that was all I ever heard. Poirot's mind began to churn again. Moreau. The name rang in his head like the echo of an old memory, but the details eluded him. There was something about Moreau that seemed important, but whether it was crucial to the case or merely another shadowy figure in the background, Poirot could not say just yet. As he and Hastings stepped outside, the Parisian evening greeted them with its usual mix of damp air and flickering streetlights. The city felt alive with its stories, its secrets, and its mysteries. But Poirot was not yet finished with his investigation. He had learned much, but he knew there was more to uncover. Poirot, Hastings said after a moment, his voice almost a whisper. Do you think Westfield's return has something to do with this betrayal?
Is that why he came back? Poirot paused for a moment, gazing down at the street below. The weight of the question hung in the air, as though the answer itself was a piece of the puzzle, one that had not yet fully revealed itself. It is possible. Hastings. Perhaps Westfield returned to right a wrong, to seek vengeance or redemption, though I believe it may be something far more complicated.
They walked on, the clicking of Poirot's shoes against the wet pavement steady, his mind turning over the possibilities. And the letter, he said softly, more to himself than to Hastings. It spoke of a debt. What kind of debt? Could it be a moral debt, or something far darker? We must find the answers, Hastings. This mystery is far from over. The streets of Paris stretched before them, as quiet and mysterious as ever, but Poirot knew that the truth was waiting just around the corner. There were more pieces to find, more people to speak to, and more layers of the past to uncover. And When those pieces finally fell into place, the truth would be revealed, an answer both surprising and inevitable. But for now they were left with only shadows, and in the shadows secrets waited to be discovered. Chapter 6. The Widow's Secrets. Air in the private study at the Carlyle estate was thick with tension. The room, which had once been the setting for quiet evenings and intellectual debates, now felt heavy with secrets. The heavy curtains, drawn tightly against the daylight, cast the room in an atmosphere of suffocating stillness. Mrs. Westfield, the widow, sat in a plush armchair by the fire, her eyes hollow with grief, but Poirot could not ignore the slight shift in her demeanour as he entered. She was an accomplished woman, accustomed to maintaining control, and it was that very control that seemed to betray her now. She stood as Poirot entered, her hands trembling slightly as she offered a delicate, almost automatic, handshake. "Monsieur." "Poirot," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I trust you are well." Poirot took her hand, his grip firm, but his gaze was fixed on her face, studying her every movement. "Madame Westfield, I am sorry for your loss," he said, his tone polite, but devoid of sympathy. It was an affectation, a mask that he had learned to adopt over the years. His true focus lay in the details, the subtle signs that told a different story from the one she wished to present. "But I am here to ask you some questions regarding your late husband's return and the unfortunate events that followed." Mrs. Westfield's eyes darted briefly to the fire, and Poirot noticed the way her fingers gripped the edge of her chair, knuckles pale under the pressure. "Of course," she murmured, lowering herself back into her seat with an air of exhaustion. "I understand that you must have many questions. It's all so overwhelming. James's return was miraculous, yes, but also terrifying. I never expected to lose him again so soon." Poirot tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "Indeed, his return was an extraordinary event, and now, madame, we must seek the truth of what happened." He took a seat across from her, observing her carefully as he spoke. "I have spoken to many who knew Captain Westfield during the war, and I am beginning to piece together certain facts that lead me to believe that his death and now his return are not as they appear." The widow's breath caught for a moment, and Poirot noted the faintest tremor that passed through
Her. What do you mean?" Her voice was barely audible, as if she feared the very words she had spoken. "Madame," Poirot began, his tone soft but steady, "there are many things that I must understand in order to clear up the confusion."
Why was it, for example, that Captain Westfield's body was never recovered? Why was he presumed dead, but now returned with no clear explanation? Her lips pressed tightly together, and for a moment she remained silent, staring into the fire. Poirot didn't press her immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to grow, watching her. The widow shifted uncomfortably in her chair, as if she were struggling with a decision. Finally, she spoke, her words carefully measured. "James, he had been involved in something dangerous during the war. He told me very little about it. There were men, officers, who were not to be trusted. He thought he had escaped, but perhaps he did not." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Escape? From what, madame? Was there someone or something he feared?" Mrs. Westfield hesitated, her eyes flickering to the side, as if seeking refuge in the shadows. "He was always secretive after the war, monsieur. He said he couldn't talk about it, that there were people who might still want to harm him, but I never asked. I thought that it was just the madness of the war. I didn't press him." Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities, but he did not show his thoughts on his face. "And yet, madame, it is not only your husband's return that—"
"I must inquire about, but also his death. See, I found a rather curious document among his personal effects, a life insurance policy."
"It bears a very interesting clause, one that would make you, madame, the sole beneficiary in the event of his death." Mrs. Westfield paled slightly, but she did not flinch. Instead, she turned her face towards him with a kind of stiff composure. "What of it, Monsieur Poirot?" Her voice remained calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. Poirot's gaze was unflinching as he leaned forward. "The policy, madame, was taken out shortly before your husband's return, and it would pay a substantial amount should something happen to him."
"I find that curious. Why was it necessary for your husband to insure such a large sum for you, and yet leave no indication of why? Was there a particular reason for the policy?" Mrs. Westfield's lips parted slightly, but she quickly regained
control. He must have done it because of his concerns, monsieur. You know the war, the instability. We all do things we don't understand in such times." Poirot nodded slowly, though his mind worked at a different angle. "Perhaps, madame. But then I must ask, how does one explain the photograph I found in your husband's belongings? A photograph of Captain Westfield with a woman who is not
you." At the mention of the photograph, Mrs. Westfield's entire demeanour shifted. Her face, which had been pale with grief, now flushed with something less easily deciphered. "What woman?" she asked sharply, her voice tight with the slightest
hint of panic. "A woman," Poirot repeated, unfazed by the sudden change in her posture. "A woman whom your husband seemed to have known well. Closely, perhaps. A woman who, unlike yourself, does not appear to have been a part of his life during the war." Her breath quickened, and for a moment she glanced toward the bookshelf, her fingers curling into a tight fist. Poirot did not need to speak further. The image of the woman in the photograph was still fresh in his mind. The look in her eyes was one of familiarity, an intimacy that betrayed more than just a passing acquaintance. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense, "the secrets you hold, I am afraid, are many, and I believe you are not as transparent as you would like to appear." Mrs. Westfield's expression faltered, her resolve cracking just for a moment. Then she leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply, as though she had just made a decision. "Perhaps you are right," she murmured, her voice betraying a hint of resignation. "But you must understand, Monsieur Poirot, that not all secrets are meant to be exposed." Poirot straightened, his eyes never leaving hers. "Perhaps not, madame, but I must expose those that are dangerous, those that lead to death. You see—"
"My little grey cells do not forget, and the clues you have given me are far from insignificant." He stood, preparing to leave. Mrs. Westfield did not attempt to stop him, though her eyes followed him with an unreadable expression.
Before he could reach the door, Poirot turned back to face her once more. "Madame," he said softly, "you would do well to remember that it is not the secrets we hide that destroy us, but the lies we allow to grow in their place." With that, Poirot stepped out of the study, leaving Mrs. Westfield alone with her thoughts, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. As Poirot and Hastings left the estate, Hastings spoke in a low voice. "What do you make of her, Poirot? Do you believe she's involved?" Poirot's response was calm, yet filled with quiet certainty. "Involved, Hastings? Perhaps. But the web is far more intricate than a simple motive of greed or revenge. No, there is something deeper at play here. The photograph, the insurance policy, The secret woman. All of these pieces tell me that we are only beginning to uncover the truth. And the truth, my friend, will soon reveal itself in ways that none of us expect. The door to the estate creaked, shut behind them, but the mystery of Captain Westfield's return and his untimely death was far from over. Chapter 7. Unravelling the Past. The weather had taken a sharp turn as Poirot made his way to the War Memorial in London. The rain had softened to a light drizzle, but the overcast sky and the grey mist that lingered over the city gave the entire scene an air of melancholy. The monument stood tall in the centre of a quiet park, surrounded by the hushed voices of history and memory. It was here that many had come to honour the dead, but for Poirot it was a place to consider the living and the secrets they hid. He stood before the polished stone, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement as he examined the names etched into the surface. Each one represented a life lost, a family torn apart, a promise broken. But it was one name that caught his attention: Captain James Westfield, the very man whose death had sparked a chain of tragic events, the same man whose miraculous return had led to so many questions. Poirot was not one for idle memorials, but there was something about standing here among the past that seemed to hold the key to understanding the present. He had already gone through Captain Westfield's military records with a meticulous eye, and as he stood before the monument, he could not help but recall the discrepancies that had been brought to light. There was something deeply unusual about Westfield's death, or rather his supposed death. As Poirot approached the memorial's edge, he turned toward Hastings, who had accompanied him on this latest leg of the investigation. The two had been quiet for most of the walk, but now Poirot spoke, his voice soft yet filled with conviction. "Hastings, do you know that the military records of Captain Westfield, the reports of his death, have many inconsistencies?" Poirot's words were punctuated with a slight shake of his head. "Indeed, they do not make sense when examined carefully. They say he died in a trench in France, but there are contradictions, conflicting reports of the circumstances surrounding his demise." Hastings blinked, clearly unsettled. "But he was officially declared dead, Poirot. How could there be discrepancies?" Poirot's gaze hardened as he looked down at the wet pavement, the drizzle tracing the edge of his coat. "That is precisely the point, my friend. The official records tell one story, but there is another tale, one that lies
hidden in the shadows.
Captain Westfield's family was notified of his death by a source other than the military." "By whom, then?" Hastings asked, his curiosity piqued. Poirot turned, his expression intense. "That, mon ami, is the mystery that requires solving. It was not a military officer who brought the news to Mrs. Westfield as one might expect. It was someone else entirely, a civilian, someone with no clear connection to the armed forces. The question becomes, why would someone outside the military apparatus take it upon themselves to deliver such news?" Hastings remained silent, deep in thought, his mind working to keep up with Poirot's deductions. The implications of such a discovery were unsettling. It suggested a level of premeditation. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the Westfields believed James was dead. Poirot's eyes were fixed on the memorial as he continued. "This suggests, Hastings, that Captain Westfield may not have died at all. Perhaps he staged his own death. Perhaps he had a reason for disappearing, something to hide, something to protect." Hastings frowned, absorbing the weight of Poirot's words. "But why would he do such a thing? Why would he fake his death only to return later in such a mysterious way?" Poirot paused, watching the raindrops trickle down the smooth surface. of the monument, as though the past itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. That, my friend, is what we must uncover. But we cannot forget that his return, as miraculous as it seems, could be the culmination of a carefully devised plan. A plan to settle something unfinished, something buried in the past. Poirot turned away from the memorial and gestured toward a small cafe in the corner of the square. "Let us go, Hastings. There is still much to discover, and we are only beginning to see the larger picture." As the two made their way toward the cafe, Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities. He was sure of one thing. Captain Westfield had returned for a reason. But what could that reason be? And was it connected to the war, to the fateful mission he had been a part of, or to something far darker, far more personal? Inside the cafe, Poirot and Hastings settled at a corner table where Poirot once again pulled out the files he had gathered, military records, photographs, letters. They spread them out before him, the various pieces of the puzzle laid bare. Poirot's keen eyes scanned the documents, taking in the finer details that others might have missed. "There is something," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to Hastings, in the way the military communicated with the family, a certain detachment, as if they did not wish to take responsibility for the information. It is as though they knew more than they were willing to admit. Hastings leaned forward, eager for more insight. "But you still haven't explained why someone outside the military would inform the family of his death. That seems too strange to ignore." Poirot nodded slowly. But it is the key to understanding the deception. The person who delivered the news could very well have been involved in a cover-up. They may have been part of a scheme to keep Captain Westfield's true fate a secret, perhaps even someone who wanted him out of the way permanently, for reasons that remain unclear." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he pondered the military reports again. "And there is another peculiar detail, Hastings. A reference in the records to a disappearing act, a phrase I find quite unusual for a military report. It is not the sort of term one expects in such formal correspondence. No, this was a deliberate attempt to obscure the truth. Someone, somewhere, wanted to make it clear that Captain Westfield's death was not to be questioned." Hastings looked puzzled. "But why would anyone go to such lengths to deceive everyone? Why not just let him live his life quietly?" Poirot folded his hands, his expression somber. "That is the question, Hastings. What was it that Captain Westfield was trying to hide? Was he the victim of a conspiracy, or was he, in fact, the architect of his own disappearance?" Poirot's mind was already racing ahead, his little grey cells working in overdrive. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together slowly, but there was still a gap, something elusive, something he could not yet grasp. "You must remember, Hastings," Poirot continued, "this is not merely about a man who returned from the dead. It is about what he left behind, what he hoped to escape, and whether that escape was voluntary or forced. The answer, I believe, lies in what he was running from, his past, his actions during the war. Something he feared." They sat in silence. Poirot's gaze shifted to the small stack of letters on the table before him, one in particular catching his attention. It was a letter from a French woman, one of the few pieces of correspondence Westfield had kept from the time before his supposed death. "I must visit Paris again, Hastings," Poirot said suddenly, his voice sharp with purpose. "There is more to this letter than meets the eye. We are not yet finished." With that, Poirot stood, his resolve unwavering. The game was afoot, and he knew now that the answers lay across the Channel, hidden in the streets and shadows of Paris. Chapter 8. The French Connection. The soft murmur of voices filled the air as Poirot and Hastings entered the Veterans Club, its walls lined with photographs of soldiers, many of them wearing the faded uniforms of the Great War. The room had a distinct, weathered charm to it, as though the years had layered a sense of history over everything within. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that only those who had lived through the horrors of war could understand. Yet it was tempered with camaraderie, a shared bond of survival, however broken or fragile. Poirot's keen eyes scanned the room, finally resting on a figure seated at a table in the far corner. The man was older now, his uniform a memory, but there was still a hardness to his expression. Henri Durand was a man who carried the weight of the war in every line of his face. His eyes, sharp and suspicious, followed Poirot's approach. "Monsieur."
"Durand," Poirot began, his French impeccable, though his voice was tinged with a note of calm authority. "I hope I am not intruding. I have come to speak with you about a certain Captain James Westfield."
Durand's gaze flickered at the mention of the name, and for a moment it was as if a shadow passed over his face. He did not answer immediately, but motioned to the chair across from him. Poirot and Hastings sat, and Poirot wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "I understand, Monsieur Durand, that you served with Captain Westfield during the war. He has returned from the dead, as it were. I would like to know if you can tell me anything about him, anything unusual that might help shed light on the circumstances of his death or his return." Durand's fingers tightened around the edge of his glass, his eyes flickering nervously toward the other men in the room. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low, guarded. "Westfield," Durand began slowly, his gaze flicking over to the windows as if searching for something.
"He was different after that mission."
"That damn mission in the trenches, the one that went wrong." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What mission was that?" Durand swallowed, his throat tight. "A covert operation behind enemy lines. We were supposed to gather intelligence, but everything went to hell. There was an explosion, and Westfield Durand's voice faltered, and he looked away, clearly trying to steady himself. "He was injured, severely. But when the rescue team came, he trailed off, clearly unsettled by the memory. And yet," Poirot prodded gently, "you were told that Captain Westfield died in that operation?" Durand's eyes darted back to Poirot, a fleeting flash of unease crossing his features. Yes, that's what we were told. But you see, Poirot," he lowered his voice to a near whisper, "I saw him after, just for a moment. When they thought he was dead, I saw him. It was in the hospital back in France. He was in a different ward, recovering. No one else knew, not even the officers. But I knew. I saw him." Poirot's lips curled into a slight smile. "You saw him alive after the official report stated he was dead?" Durand nodded grimly. "Yes. He was, different. Changed in some way. His eyes—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing what he was revealing. A nervous twitch passed through his hand, and he gripped his glass tighter, clearly uncomfortable. Poirot, sensing the shift in Durand's mood, leaned back slightly, observing him carefully. "But you said nothing? You did not tell anyone of this?" "No," Durand replied quickly, his voice laced with tension. "I was afraid. If I had spoken, I would have been branded a traitor, a liar. They would have thought I was mad." See, Poirot, war changes men, but it also makes them keep their silence. I knew that if I spoke, no one would believe me." Poirot studied the man closely. There was something in Durand's voice, something in his eyes that suggested more than just fear. There was guilt, raw and unspoken. Poirot's mind was already at work, piecing the fragments of the story together. "And after that, Monsieur Durand, you never spoke of it again?" Poirot asked, his tone still gentle but insistent. Durand hesitated, his gaze flicking to the door. Then, lowering his voice even further, he finally spoke. "There was more. A few months later, I heard whispers, rumors. Men from our unit, they, said Westfield, had disappeared. Not dead, disappeared. There were men who knew the truth, but no one dared speak of it. Not after the war, not after what happened." He paused, then looked directly at Poirot. "There were some who said, He died twice." Poirot's brows furrowed. "Twice, you say?" Durand's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Poirot thought he would say no more. But after a long silence, Durand leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's something else. Something I'm not proud of. I don't know if it was Westfield or if it was someone else, but that night of the explosion, there was a man who was supposed to be dead, but wasn't. I don't know who he was, but I know one thing. He was connected to Westfield's disappearance." Poirot's mind raced as the pieces began to slot together, but just as quickly his thoughts were interrupted. Durand's face had grown pale, and his hand was shaking slightly. He seemed to be on the verge of revealing something more, but then, as though realizing the weight of what he was about to divulge, he abruptly stood up. "That's all I can say, Monsieur Poirot," Durand said, his voice tight. "I've said enough. You should go. It's not safe to ask any more questions. Not here, not now." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he observed Durand's sudden change in behavior. His nervousness was palpable, his reluctance to speak further more telling than the words he had already shared. Durand had hidden something important, and Poirot had a feeling it was connected to the core of the mystery. "I understand, Monsieur Durand," Poirot said, rising from his seat. "But know this, what you have told me is far from trivial. It is essential to my investigation, and I will find the truth no matter how difficult it may be." Durand didn't respond, his eyes darting toward the door, clearly eager for Poirot to leave. With a final glance at the man, Poirot turned to Hastings, who had been quietly observing the exchange. "Well, Hastings," Poirot said, adjusting his coat, "it seems that we have learned something of great importance today, but also that our friend Monsieur Durand is hiding more than he is willing to admit. I suggest we pursue this thread further. There is much more to this story than a simple disappearance." The two men stepped out of the club, and as they walked down the rain-slicked streets of Paris, Poirot could not shake the feeling that they were on the verge of a revelation. The phrase, "a man who died twice," echoed in his mind, stirring a sense of foreboding. Someone, or something, was hiding the truth, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. As they turned a corner, Poirot paused for a moment, staring thoughtfully into the distance. "Hastings," he said quietly, "I believe we are about to discover something that will change everything we thought we knew about Captain Westfield and his return." The hunt, Poirot knew, was far from over. Chapter 9. The Soldier's Return. The mansion stood isolated on a stretch of barren land, its weathered stone walls a silent testament to years of solitude. A slight mist clung to the overgrown hedges, and the faint echo of the wind's whisper added an eerie quality to the otherwise quiet landscape. In a secluded corner of the estate, the gathering was about to take place. The key players in this unfolding drama had been summoned by Poirot, each with their role to play, though none of them could yet see how they would fit into the conclusion he was carefully constructing. The drawing-room was dim, lit only by the flickering flames of a low burning fire. Poirot, in his usual meticulous fashion, had arranged the seating so that he could observe every nuance, every shift of emotion in the faces of the people around him. Colonel Carlyle, Mrs. Westfield, the enigmatic Miss Lambert, and Durand, whose nervousness had not subsided since their last meeting, were all present, their expressions a mix of anxiety and confusion. Each one felt the weight of the silence, the unspoken understanding that Poirot was about to reveal the truth that had been evading them all. Poirot took a moment before speaking, his eyes moving from one person to the next. The room was charged with an undercurrent of tension, but Poirot, ever the master of calm, seemed unaffected. "It is curious, is it not?" he said, finally, breaking the silence. "How the truth has a way of hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered?" He paused, ensuring that all eyes were on him. Mrs. Westfield, who had been sitting stiffly with her hands folded in her lap, shifted uncomfortably. She had the look of a woman who knew the game was up, but was still trying to maintain the illusion of composure. Her grief, Poirot noted, was a carefully constructed facade, too exaggerated, too performative, to be entirely sincere. Her eyes were red, yes, but there was no true anguish behind them. Poirot's sharp gaze turned to her. "Madame," he said, gently, "your alibi?" "It seems it has fallen apart." Mrs. Westfield's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice high-pitched, forced. Poirot's gaze was unwavering. "You claim that on the night of Captain Westfield's death you were in your room, alone, with no one to witness your whereabouts." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "But a small detail has come to my attention. The servants, you see, remembered something peculiar. Miss Lambert, for example, noticed that you were not in your room for a time that evening. There was a brief moment when you were unaccounted for. A window of time that coincides precisely with the moments before Captain Westfield's death." Mrs. Westfield's face paled, and she quickly glanced at Colonel Carlyle as if seeking some form of support, but the Colonel too seemed unsettled, his brow furrowed in thought. "You misunderstand," Mrs. Westfield said, her voice losing its earlier confidence. But Poirot held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No, madame," Poirot interjected smoothly. "There is no misunderstanding. I have seen the evidence. You were not alone. You were not in your room." He took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were with someone, weren't you?" Her lips parted, but no words came. For a moment she seemed frozen, caught in the truth of what Poirot had uncovered. She looked away, as if gathering herself before she managed to speak again, though her voice had lost its earlier force. "You don't understand," she said quietly, almost pleadingly. I was with my husband. He wasn't dead, you see. He returned. And we—" She stopped abruptly, as though realizing what she had just said. Poirot's expression softened, but his gaze remained as sharp as ever. "Ah, yes. That is—" "The key, n'est-ce pas? Your husband's return, which was not a return at all. It was orchestrated." Mrs. Westfield stiffened at his words, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. "What do you mean?" she asked, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Poirot smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I believe Captain Westfield's return was not entirely of his own doing. There was someone behind it, someone who arranged his resurrection. He turned to Colonel Carlyle, his gaze unwavering. Monsieur, you knew, didn't you? You knew about the plot to bring him back. Carlyle looked taken aback, but Poirot's words were like a scalpel cutting through the facade, his hands clenched at his sides, betraying his agitation. I don't know what you mean, Poirot, the colonel stammered, but Poirot was not so easily fooled. Ah, but you do, Poirot insisted. I have found a clue, you see, a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but it is always the small things that reveal the most. A diary entry written by Captain Westfield himself. It speaks of a past betrayal, a regret, a wrong that he had to make right. The language, too, was telling. He wrote of a debt that needed to be paid. I believe that Captain Westfield's return was not simply a chance to reunite with his wife. No, it was something far more deliberate, something planned. Mrs. Westfield's face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear, but she said nothing. Poirot's gaze softened slightly, as if pitying her. And yet, Poirot continued, you, madame, made it your own. You knew that your husband was alive, but you pretended otherwise, didn't you? You staged your grief, not for the world, but for someone much closer to you, someone you were hoping to deceive. The room grew still. As Poirot's words hung in the air, Mrs. Westfield's chest rose and fell as though struggling for breath. Her eyes darted to Durand, but the Frenchman said nothing, his face a mask of uncertainty. The tension was thick, palpable, as Poirot's observations circled ever closer to the truth. And yet, Poirot murmured, it is not the return of the soldier that is of most interest to me, but the one who caused it. For there is a third party at work here, someone who has orchestrated this entire charade, hoping to settle a debt long overdue. Durand's hand shook involuntarily, and Poirot noted the change in his demeanour. It was subtle, but it was there. Poirot turned to him, the smile slipping from his face. Ah, Monsieur Durand, you've been so helpful in revealing fragments of the truth, but you, too, are part of the puzzle. The man who died twice, the soldier who betrayed Westfield in that past operation, I believe you know exactly who I mean. Durand swallowed hard, his throat constricting. He glanced at the others in the room, but they, too, seemed caught in the web Poirot was weaving. He could not escape, not any longer. You are hiding something, Monsieur Durand, Poirot pressed, and I will find it. Durand's eyes darted around the room, his lips twitching, and for a moment Poirot wondered if he might break, if the weight of his guilt would finally shatter the man's resolve. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, Durand spoke. You don't understand, Durand whispered, his voice barely audible. You can't understand. Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his mind racing as he pieced the words together. Ah, but I do understand. And now, I believe you will tell me everything. But before Poirot could press further, there was a sharp knock at the door, and the room fell silent once again. The investigation was far from over, and Poirot knew that whatever happened next would reveal the final, hidden truth. Chapter 10. The Final. Peace Poirot stood before the fireplace in his modest London apartment, a place that, in its simplicity,
never failed to ground him. The crackle of the fire seemed a steady companion to his thoughts as he turned the final pieces of the puzzle over in his mind. His ever-alert eyes flickered from the scattered papers on his desk to the carefully arranged
photographs, his mind weaving together the threads of the investigation. As the evening's shadows lengthened, the truth began to take shape, closer than ever before. Hastings, who had been quietly observing the events unfold with growing fascination, paced back and forth in the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Poirot," he said, breaking the silence, "it seems we are finally getting somewhere. The clues are starting to fit." Poirot smiled faintly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his chin. "Ah, Hastings, one must never rush the process. It is only in the final moments, when all the pieces fall into place, that the answer becomes clear. And we are very close now." Hastings stopped, a slight frown on his face. "But what about Durand and Colonel Carlyle? They both seem to know more than they're letting on. Surely they are more than mere bystanders." Poirot shook his head, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Yes, they are important, of course, but one must never mistake a distraction for the real issue at hand. The key to understanding this case does not lie with them, but with the circumstances of Westfield's death, and, more importantly, his return. Hastings raised an eyebrow. "And the dirt on his boot?" Poirot nodded, his expression turning serious. "That, my friend, is the final detail that I believe will unravel everything. The dirt on Captain Westfield's boot, remember, the one found at the scene of his death. It is not from any typical part of the estate, it is from a very specific location in France, a place near the battlefield where Westfield supposedly died. The soil is unique to that region, marked by its distinct composition, something only a man who had been there would carry with him." Hastings blinked, taking a moment to absorb the significance of Poirot's observation. "So Westfield never
really died there? But how?" Poirot held up a hand, his expression intense. "Exactly, Hastings. Westfield did not die on that battlefield. He was, in fact, very much alive, and his death was a lie. A carefully orchestrated deception. And
the man who was sent back to his family as Westfield, he was not Captain Westfield at all." Hastings stared at him, confusion mixing with disbelief. "But if that's true, then who was the man who died in Westfield's place, and why? Surely someone would have noticed the switch." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Ah, the answer to that lies in the very reason why Captain Westfield faked his death. The soldier whose body was used in his place was someone who, like Westfield, had his own dark past. It is no coincidence that Westfield's death occurred during a time when he was involved in a covert military operation, and it is no coincidence that the man who died in his place was involved in that same operation." Hastings frowned. "So you're suggesting that Westfield deliberately used another man's body to fake his own death and to escape something?" "Precisely," Poirot said, his tone more resolute now. "But not just any escape, Hastings, a calculated one. Westfield's return was not merely a matter of evading the consequences of his actions, it was a matter of settling a score. And that score, I believe, involved betrayal. A betrayal that was tied to the very operation in which he faked his death." Hastings' eyes widened. "So he staged his death to get revenge on someone who wronged him. But why the secrecy? Why not just confront them directly?" Poirot's lips twitched in a small, knowing smile. "Ah, Hastings, you see, there is always more to the story. It was not just about revenge. Westfield's return had to be done quietly with great care. He needed to ensure that no one knew he was alive, not even his closest allies. And that is where the most significant piece of the puzzle comes in, the insurance policy." Hastings blinked. "The insurance policy, what does that have to do with any of this?" Poirot walked over to his desk, where a set of papers lay neatly arranged. He carefully picked up the letter from Mrs. Westfield's collection, the one that had caused so much suspicion. It is no coincidence that Mrs. Westfield was so eager to maintain her role as the grieving widow. You see, Westfield's insurance policy contained a rather interesting clause, one that would have been activated upon his death. But this clause did not merely benefit his widow. No, Hastings, it benefited someone else, someone who would have stood to gain more from his death than anyone else. Poirot's eyes flashed as he turned to face Hastings. The person behind Westfield's return knew that Mrs. Westfield would be the perfect cover, but it was not for her benefit alone. It was, I believe, to create the perfect alibi, to give this third party the opportunity to act without suspicion. And once the truth comes out, we will see who has been pulling the strings all along. Hastings leaned in, more intrigued than ever. But who could this third party be, and what do they want? Poirot sighed, the weight of the answer clear in his expression. That, my dear Hastings, is the final question we must answer. And it is one that, I fear, will lead us down a dangerous path. A path that involves people who are willing to go to any lengths to cover their tracks. People who have more to lose than anyone realizes. The doorbell rang, its sharp chime echoing through the apartment. Poirot's face tightened with concentration. Ah, that will be the one who has come to reveal the last piece of the puzzle. Hastings exchanged a glance with his friend, clearly caught up in the gravity of the moment. Poirot turned to him with a reassuring smile. Patience, Hastings.
Is almost over. We are close to the truth. Very close. As the door swung open, revealing the figure who had arrived, Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. This was the moment when everything would finally fall into place.
The final piece of the puzzle was about to be laid before them, and Poirot was ready to see it all through to the end. Chapter 11. Unmasking the True Motive. The Carlisle estate was as grand as ever, its towering walls and manicured grounds reflecting a carefully curated sense of permanence. Yet, beneath its stately exterior, something far more sinister had been at play, a conspiracy so intricate that only Poirot, with his razor-sharp intellect, could hope to untangle it. Poirot stood in the drawing-room, the scene of so many twists and turns, his mind teeming with the knowledge he had accumulated over the past few days. There was one final question left to answer. Why had Westfield returned, and what had he intended to expose? It was clear now that his death, or rather his staged death, had been the result of more than a personal vendetta. It was the result of a conspiracy so deeply rooted in the past that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of the Carlisle family's legacy. Hastings, as always, had been at Poirot's side throughout the investigation, his quiet demeanour betraying the occasional flicker of unease. He watched Poirot, the only man who seemed able to keep pace with the twists of fate, and could not help but marvel at how the Belgian detective could see connections where others saw only confusion. Poirot, Hastings said softly, you've
uncovered so much already, but the picture is still murky. What are you getting at? Why did Westfield go to such lengths to fake his death, only to return years later?
Poirot turned from the window, his sharp eyes narrowing in thought. Ah, Hastings, it is not just a matter of revenge, no. There was something far greater at stake, something tied to the very core of the Carlisle family's fortune. The conspiracy began in the days of the Great War, a time when many lives were forever altered by betrayal and hidden motives. Westfield, it seems, was not just a soldier. He was part of something far more dangerous, something that Colonel Carlisle was deeply
involved in. Hastings frowned. But how could Carlisle have been involved in such a scheme?
He's been the model of integrity, hasn't he? Poirot's expression was inscrutable. A model of integrity, yes, but also a man with much to lose. During the war, Carlyle, Westfield, and several others, including Durand, were part of a covert operation, a secret mission that had nothing to do with battlefields and trenches. They were after something far more valuable, a hidden fortune, hidden away by a wealthy French benefactor who had perished in the conflict. This fortune, if recovered, would be worth more than most could imagine. Hastings stared, absorbing the weight of Poirot's words. So, Westfield wasn't just faking his death to escape, he was faking it to uncover something. Precisely, Poirot said, his voice low and steady. But what Westfield uncovered was a deep betrayal. Carlyle, you see, had manipulated the situation. He used the death of his comrades, Westfield among them, to claim the fortune for himself. But Westfield did not die, as everyone believed. No, he was part of the plan, but he was the one who would not be silenced. Hastings looked confused. But how could Carlyle get away with it? Why would Westfield return now? Poirot's gaze darkened as he reached for a small, leather-bound journal that had been found among Colonel Carlyle's personal effects. The journal had been carefully hidden, its pages filled with guilt-ridden confessions that Poirot had already begun to decipher. He flipped it open, his fingers tracing the ink as he spoke. "Here," he said softly. "In this journal, Carlyle reveals the truth. He speaks of the men he betrayed, of the plan he set in motion to take the fortune for himself. He was involved in the operation, yes, but he did not want to share the reward. Carlyle saw an opportunity and he took it. He arranged for Westfield's death to be faked so that he could have the treasure all to himself. But the guilt, it seems, never left him. He knew that the truth would come out one day." Hastings leaned forward, clearly fascinated. But if Carlyle knew the truth, why didn't he destroy the journal? Why leave it for someone to find? Poirot's lips curled into a wry smile. "That is the question, Hastings. It is almost as though Carlyle wanted someone, perhaps even us, to find this journal. He is a man who craves redemption but does not want to face the consequences of his actions. It is his one weakness, his guilt." Hastings was silent for a moment, digesting the revelation. So Westfield's return was not just for revenge, but to expose Carlyle? "Exactly," Poirot affirmed. Westfield knew that his death had been faked, and that Carlyle had lied to everyone. He returned to confront the man who had betrayed him, and to expose the conspiracy he had been a part of. But, as we know, things did not go according to plan. Westfield was murdered before he could finish what he started. Poirot paused, glancing at the door, as though expecting someone to enter. Hastings followed his gaze, sensing that the next steps of the investigation were imminent. The final piece of the puzzle, Hastings, is the matter of Carlyle's motivations. His guilt over what he did to Westfield is deep, but so too is his fear. The truth, once revealed, would destroy him. But not just him. It would also destroy the lives of others involved in this conspiracy. People like Durand, who have been hiding their own dark secrets. Hastings narrowed his eyes. "Durand? You mean he was in on it too?" Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Durand is a man who has lived with his own remorse. He has not confessed, but I believe he too was complicit in the betrayal. His nervousness when questioned, his reluctance to provide full details, it all points to his fear of being implicated. He knows that if the truth comes out, he too will be caught in the web of deceit. Hastings sank back into his chair, the weight of the investigation settling over him. So Carlyle, Durand, and others. They were all part of this conspiracy. They lied, they betrayed, and they killed. Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. Yes, Hastings, and now the truth must come to light. The final confrontation will be inevitable. At that moment the door opened, and Mrs. Westfield entered, her face a mask of grief as always, but something in her eyes betrayed her, an unease that was hard to ignore. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Hercule Poirot," she said, her voice wavering, but controlled. "I need to speak with you. It's about my husband, Captain Westfield. I know now who is behind everything, and I have something you must see, something that will change everything." Poirot's heart quickened. This, he knew, was the moment he had been waiting for. The last piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed. Chapter 12. The guilt of betrayal. The drawing-room of the Carlyle estate was eerily quiet, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound to punctuate the tension that hung in the air. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his sharp eyes sweeping across the faces of the gathered individuals. Mrs. Westfield, pale and trembling, sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Colonel Carlyle stood near the window, his posture rigid, his face a study of controlled anxiety. Henri Durand, looking slightly more worn than when Poirot had first met him, sat stiffly in a chair beside Carlyle, his eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. It was clear now that the final threads of this long, tangled web were ready to be pulled. Poirot's mind, ever keen, pieced together the last few details that had eluded him until now. The truth was finally within reach. "I must thank you all for coming," Poirot said, his voice calm yet firm, his French accent clear as ever. "I know that this has been an unsettling time for all of you, but I believe we are now on the precipice of understanding what happened to Captain Westfield and who is responsible for his death." Mrs. Westfield's face betrayed nothing more than a flicker of uncertainty as she lifted her eyes to meet Poirot's gaze. She had remained, throughout the investigation, an enigma. But something in her demeanour now suggested that she knew what was coming, that she was preparing for a revelation she had long suspected. Poirot turned his attention to Colonel Carlyle, who, despite his outward composure, seemed to be a man on the verge of collapse. His eyes avoided Poirot's for a brief moment before locking on to his, a flash of something, defiance, or perhaps guilt, passing through them. "The time for secrets is over, mon ami," Poirot continued, his gaze unwavering. "We know now the role you played in Captain Westfield's death, Colonel Carlyle. It was you who arranged for his disappearance, you who orchestrated the entire charade." Carlyle's face tightened, his hand gripping the back of a chair as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "You're wrong, Poirot," he said, his voice low and strained. "It was necessary. You don't understand." Poirot stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Carlyle. "Necessary? But why, Colonel? Why was it necessary to fake the death of a man who had no idea of the fate you were sealing for him? Why, after the war, did you choose to let Westfield die a second time, when he was already dead to the world?" Carlyle hesitated, his breath coming shallow. "Because I had no choice," he said at last, his voice faltering slightly. "It was the only way to protect my family, to protect everything I had built. The fortune, the estate, my legacy, it all depended on it." Poirot's expression softened, though only slightly. "Ah, the legacy," he murmured. "The very thing that drove you to betray not just Westfield, but the men who fought alongside you." You sought to ensure your place in history, Colonel Carlyle, but in doing so, you destroyed the lives of others." A silence stretched between them. Carlyle's eyes glinted with a mixture of pride and regret, as though he were both haunted by the consequences of his actions and oddly proud of the results. "I didn't have a choice," he repeated. "The war. It changed everything. The fortune we were promised was real, but only if I kept the secret. Only if I made sure that Westfield, Durand, and the others would never tell anyone about what really happened. It was the only way I could protect my family's future. You can't understand what would have happened to my wife. My son?" Poirot's lips tightened. "And what of Captain Westfield? What of the betrayal you heaped upon him? You stole his future, his chance at a normal life, all in the name of protecting your family's fortune. What do you say to that, Colonel?" Carlyle's eyes flickered, guilt flashing through him like a storm cloud passing overhead. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt," he said, his voice softer now. "I never meant for any of it to go this far, but Westfield, he would have ruined everything. If he had come back and exposed what we did, it would have been over. The family would have been destroyed." Poirot studied him for a long moment, his mind processing the confession. It wasn't the full truth, of course. Carlyle was still hiding something. But it was enough to explain the man's actions. There was no denying the Colonel's desperation to protect his name and his legacy. In his mind, it had been a necessary evil, a betrayal justified by the greater good of preserving his family's future. Poirot shifted his gaze to Durand, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange. The Frenchman's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously from Carlyle to Poirot, then back again. Poirot had long suspected that Durand, too, had played a role in the conspiracy, but the exact nature of that role had eluded him until now. "Durand?" Poirot said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You were involved, weren't you? You were there, part of the plan, complicit in the cover-up. But you've been hiding the truth." "Why?" Durand swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in his seat.
I didn't want any part of it, I swear," he stammered. "But Carlyle, he threatened me. He said I would lose everything, my reputation, my livelihood, my future. I had no choice but to go along with it."
Poirot nodded slowly, acknowledging the fear that had driven Durand into complicity. "So it was fear, then, that kept you silent all these years?" Durand nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes. I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke out. I knew the truth would destroy me. And it would destroy Carlyle, too." Poirot's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "Yes, the truth has a way of doing that," he murmured. He turned to Mrs. Westfield, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Her face, though still pale, had a look of quiet resignation about it. "And what of you, madame? You've been silent, but your actions have not gone unnoticed. You knew your husband's return was not what it seemed. Why didn't you speak up?" Mrs. Westfield's eyes flickered, and for a moment Poirot saw a flicker of something, an emotion that he could not immediately place. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a calm, almost detached air. She looked at Poirot, then Carlyle, then back to Poirot. "I knew," she said softly, her voice steady, "but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that my husband, the man I had loved, could be a part of something so terrible. I thought if I ignored it, if I pretended it wasn't true, it would go away. But it didn't." Poirot's gaze softened. "And you, Madame were not driven by greed, as I suspected. No, your concern was your son, was it not? Your desire to protect him from the consequences of the past. Mrs. Westfield nodded, her eyes glistening. Yes, she whispered. I wanted to protect him, to make sure he had a future without the stain of his father's mistakes. Poirot gave a small nod of understanding. Mrs. Westfield had been a victim too, trapped by love and fear. There was no malice in her actions, only a desire to shield her son from the horrors of his father's past. With the truth laid bare, Poirot took a step back, allowing the weight of the moment to settle in the room. The lies, the betrayals, the cover-ups, all had been revealed. But as Poirot's eyes swept across the room, he knew that this was only the beginning. There was still more to be uncovered, more to be understood. The final act of this sordid drama was yet to come, and as Poirot's gaze met Carlyle's, he knew the Colonel would stop at nothing to protect what was his. The game, as it had always been, was far from over. Chapter 13. The Soldier. Who came back? Poirot sat at his desk, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He gazed out of the window, the gentle hum of London's evening traffic filling the air. His fingers were steepled, his mind racing through the labyrinth of facts he had gathered, piecing them together like a puzzle with missing pieces. He was so close now. Only a few final steps remained before the truth would be laid bare for all to see. He had been on the edge of the answer for days, but now it was finally clear. The mystery of Captain Westfield's return, the deception, the betrayal, the long-hidden secrets, was not what it had initially seemed. It was more than a tale of revenge or greed. It was a story of loyalty, of friendship, and ultimately of an unshakable desire for justice, even at the cost of one's own life. His mind drifted back to the crucial moments that had unravelled the case, to the final pieces that had clicked into place after the confrontation at the Carlyle estate. Poirot had seen, as he always did, the smallest details, the things that no one else noticed, especially the way Carlyle had tried so desperately to cover his guilt with excuses, with pride, and with deflection. But it had not worked, not against the little grey cells. The final revelation had come when Poirot examined Westfield's personal effects in greater detail, the pieces that had been left behind in the wake of his faked death. There had been something about the soldier's body, the wrong body, that had given him pause. When he had first heard of the apparent death of Westfield, Poirot had felt something was amiss, though he couldn't place it. The reports from the war had been vague, as they often were in such tragic circumstances, but there had been a slight discrepancy, a detail in the description of the body, and it had been this one small inconsistency that had led him to the heart of the mystery. Now, with a sigh, Poirot picked up the photograph of Captain Westfield that had been sent to the Westfield family after the supposed death. He studied the face of the young man in the photograph, a face frozen in time, a man who had died before his own eyes, before his family's eyes. Or had he? The clue had come from the most unlikely of places. Carlyle's journal, a piece of evidence Poirot had dismissed in the early stages of his investigation. It had been too easy, too obvious, but when he read it again, carefully, he realized that it contained the missing pieces of the puzzle. Carlyle had been the orchestrator of the deception. It was Carlyle who had made the arrangements not only to cover up Westfield's supposed death, but to ensure that Westfield himself would be lost to the world forever. Poirot smiled thinly as he recalled the moment of insight. Carlyle had mentioned in his journal the importance of a certain location in France, a place tied to the war, a place where certain men had fought and died. It was there, at the very site of a blood-soaked battlefield, that Carlyle had made the secret arrangement that would seal Westfield's fate. Poirot's eyes narrowed as the final pieces fell into place. The soldier who had died on the battlefield was not Captain Westfield. It had been another man, a soldier of similar build, someone who had been killed in the same skirmish, someone whose identity had been carefully erased. The body had been switched, the paperwork falsified, and Westfield had disappeared. Carlyle, in his desperation to secure his family's fortune, had orchestrated the entire thing. He had sent Westfield off to the depths of France, where the soldier would remain, hidden and forgotten. But Westfield had not stayed forgotten. He had returned not for revenge, but to expose Carlyle's betrayal, to ensure that the truth would be known. He had staged his own resurrection in order to bring to light the lies that had been built around him. Poirot's thoughts returned to Mrs. Westfield, whose grief had seemed so genuine, yet so calculated. She had believed in her husband's death, of course. How could she not? She had mourned the man she had loved, the man she had thought was gone forever. But Poirot had seen the truth in her eyes when he'd questioned her. She had been hiding something, and it was only in the final moments of the investigation that she had admitted it. She had known the truth all along. Her husband had not died as reported. She had known that he had not died in the war, but rather had faked his death to keep him safe. She had been complicit in the cover-up, not out of malice, but out of a desire to protect their son from the truth of the war's terrible cost. And then there was Henri Durand. The French veteran had been a key witness to the events of that tragic day, but his fear had kept him silent. Poirot had suspected for a long time that Durand knew more than he was letting on, but it had only been in their final conversation that the man had confessed. He had been there when Westfield's body had been swapped, had witnessed the deception firsthand. But like the others, he had been too afraid of the consequences to speak. Now, with everything laid bare, Poirot turned his mind back to the most pressing question of all. Why had Westfield chosen to return after all these years? What had driven him to resurface when he could have stayed hidden forever? Poirot smiled, a small, knowing smile. It wasn't vengeance, as many had assumed. It wasn't a need for retribution against those who had wronged him. No, Captain Westfield had returned because he had a duty to the truth, a duty to the men who had died in that war, and to those who had been betrayed. He had returned not for his own sake, but for the sake of others. It was an unexpected answer, but one that fit perfectly into the puzzle. And now, as Poirot leaned back in his chair, he felt a deep satisfaction in the knowledge that justice would be served. The truth, as it always did, would prevail. The lies, the deception, the betrayal, they were all part of the past now, and it was time to bring it all to an end. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, savouring the quiet calm that had settled over him. He had done it again. He had uncovered the truth, solved the mystery, and brought peace to those whose lives had been torn apart by lies and deception. It was always the same, the satisfaction of the puzzle, the joy of seeing the pieces fit together in perfect harmony. But as he opened his eyes again, he couldn't help but feel a small, nagging sense of unease. There was something about this case, something that didn't quite sit right. Poirot's mind raced, and he paused for a moment, staring at the photograph of Captain Westfield once more. There was one last question, one last piece that needed to be answered. Who exactly had ordered Westfield's death in the first place? The answer was out there, somewhere. And Poirot knew that the investigation wasn't truly over, at least not yet. Chapter 14. The Methodical Mind. The soft crackling of the fire in the drawing-room of the Carlyle estate was the only sound that filled the air, as Hercule Poirot stood silently in front of the gathered group. He could feel their eyes upon him, each suspect hanging on his every word, waiting for the inevitable conclusion to the web of lies and deceit that had been spun around them. But Poirot remained calm, his thoughts ordered, as ever, into the neatest of compartments, like the tiny grey cells he so often referred to. It was the final act of the mystery now, and Poirot had all the pieces in place. The last thread had been pulled, unravelling the dark truth of Colonel Carlyle's involvement, his guilt, and the murder he had committed twice over. He glanced over the room briefly, Mrs. Westfield, her face pale and drawn, her eyes still filled with a kind of disbelief. Henri Durand, who was shifting uncomfortably in his chair, and Colonel Carlyle, who sat in a stiffened posture, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he clenched them together on his lap. Poirot noticed none of them dared to speak, their eyes locked on him as if he were a lion about to pounce. His gaze returned to Carlyle. The colonel was sweating now, beads of perspiration glistening on his brow. His earlier arrogance had long since faded. The facade of control that Carlyle had worn so carefully had cracked under the weight of Poirot's deductions. The truth now laid bare between them. "You are wondering," Poirot began, his voice smooth and composed, "how it is that you have found yourself caught in this web."
I can assure you it was not by accident, Colonel. It was by your own hand. Carlyle swallowed, his lips dry, his throat tight. He opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing, as though the words were caught somewhere between his mind and his conscience. "You
"Thought you had covered your tracks," Poirot continued, "but you had forgotten one thing, the simplest thing, the most crucial thing, a letter." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope, carefully unfolded, its contents now revealed for all to see. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. "I found this in your office, hidden among your files," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the tension. It was Westfield's final letter, written just before his supposed death. At this, Mrs. Westfield's eyes widened, and Durand shifted uneasily. Carlyle, however, looked pale, his mouth suddenly dry. The letter itself was simple, its tone resigned, almost peaceful, but it contained the confession that Poirot had been looking for. Westfield had known that his life was in danger, not from the battlefield, but from someone much closer. He had written about a dark agreement, a pact made between men, and a sense of dread that followed him in the days before his death. It was this letter that Poirot had suspected might exist, and once it was uncovered, it confirmed what he had already suspected. Colonel Carlyle was not only responsible for the death of Captain Westfield in the war, but had in fact orchestrated it. "I am certain, Colonel," Poirot continued, "that Westfield did not die in the skirmish as the report stated. No, he was very much alive, and you knew it. You made sure of it. You sent the wrong man to the front, a soldier who died in his place. And when you received the news of Westfield's death, you knew it was your perfect opportunity." Carlyle's hand tightened around the armrest of his chair, his knuckles going white. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. His face twisted in something resembling guilt and frustration. "Why?" Poirot asked gently, his voice almost like a whisper. Why go to such lengths? Carlyle's eyes darted around the room before settling on Poirot. He looked desperate, his mind clearly working frantically, weighing his options. But Poirot knew it was too late for any excuse to save him now. "You wanted the inheritance," Poirot said, the words coming steadily, with the calmness of a man who already knew the answer. "The fortune, the family name. You made sure that Westfield's death would be irreversible so that you could claim the wealth that should have been his. You orchestrated it all, the body switch, the false reports. And then, when the war was
over, you thought you could finally breathe easy, but then... Poirot paused, letting the tension hang in the air. Then he came back.
The finality of Poirot's words seemed to hang in the air like a heavy curtain, and the room fell into an almost unbearable silence. Carlyle trembled, his face drawn with the weight of his own guilt. His breath came in ragged gasps now, as if he were finally realizing that the truth, the one truth he had tried so hard to suppress, was coming for him. Poirot set the letter down on the table before him, folding his hands neatly on top of it. But Westfield did not return for vengeance. No, he returned to expose you for what you truly are. You were the one who had betrayed him, not in the way he had thought, but in a far deeper way, one that would affect not only him, but his entire family. The final connection was now drawn. Westfield had never intended to come back and wreak havoc on Carlyle or his family. He had returned with a single goal: to unmask the truth, to expose the twisted conspiracy that had been formed during the war, one that had cost him his life. He had returned not for retribution, but for justice. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on Carlyle, watching him as the man struggled to maintain his composure. And then, finally, with a shuddering breath, Carlyle spoke. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice raw. "I did what I had to do. It was for the good of my family, for the good of the estate. I was protecting us. Westfield would have ruined everything. He had no place in our world. He was a soldier, nothing more, and when he became a threat, I had to take action." His eyes were wild now, pleading for some kind of understanding. "I did it for the future, for the legacy." Poirot stood in silence, his eyes cold and unwavering.
"And you killed him again, Colonel, this time with premeditation to protect yourself and your secret." Carlyle's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the truth finally hit him.
The man who had been so confident, so assured of his control, now appeared broken, a shadow of the person he had once been. Poirot glanced at Mrs. Westfield, who sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was a mask of grief, but now there was something else in her eyes, a quiet relief, perhaps, that the mystery was finally solved. She had been right to place her trust in Poirot, and yet Poirot could not help but feel a lingering unease. The case was closed, but he knew there was something about Carlyle's desperation, the way he clung to his justification, that left him uneasy. Had it been truly about money, or was there more beneath the surface? He didn't know yet, but he would find out. Poirot never left a mystery completely unsolved. With a final look at Carlyle, Poirot spoke the last words that sealed the fate of the man before him. "It is over, Colonel. Justice has been done." The room was silent once more, the air thick with the weight of the moment. Poirot stood in the stillness, knowing that this chapter of the mystery had come to an end, but feeling, deep down, that the story was far from finished. Chapter 15. The grand reveal The final gathering in the drawing-room of the Carlyle estate was a sombre one, the air thick with anticipation and the unspoken realization that the curtain was about to fall on this sordid tale of betrayal, greed, and murder. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the worn furniture and aged walls, almost as if the house itself was weary of the secrets it had sheltered for so long. The same faces, some pale and tight with tension, others unreadable, sat in their places. Mrs. Westfield sat at one end of the room, her hands tightly folded in her lap, her eyes distant. Durand stood near the window, his eyes betraying the weight of the truth he had helped uncover. But the most striking figure, as always, was Colonel Carlyle, seated at the centre of it all. Poirot stood at the front of the room, his small form
erect and his hands clasped behind his back, looking every inch the man of logic and method that he was.
His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the suspects who had, at various points, occupied the stage of this unfolding drama. He could feel the tension in the air, a tautness that would snap the moment the truth was finally revealed. For some time, Poirot had known how this would end. He had pieced together every clue, every conversation, every subtle shift in the demeanour of those involved, but he had waited patiently for the right moment, the right time to expose the deception that had been hiding in plain sight. "I have gathered you all here for one simple reason," Poirot began, his voice steady and calm, the tone of a man who had long since come to terms with the complexity of the case. "It is time for the truth to be revealed, for all of you to see what lies beneath the surface of this story." Carlyle, sitting with his back straight and his face stoic, shifted slightly in his seat. His fingers twitched, betraying the anxiety he no longer wished to conceal. But he said nothing. Poirot's gaze lingered on him for a moment, the look of a man who knew far more than he was letting on. Then, turning toward the others, he continued, "As you know, Colonel Carlyle has been at the centre of this investigation. He, who claimed to be an innocent man, a victim of circumstances, is, in fact, the architect of this entire web of lies and murder." There was a collective intake of breath in the room, but Poirot did not pause. His methodical mind had already connected every dot, and now it was time to expose the conspiracy that had marred the lives of so many. "You see," Poirot continued, "the death of Captain Westfield was never a simple casualty of war. No, it was a calculated plan executed with precision by a man who had much to gain from the young soldier's demise." Mrs. Westfield's eyes flickered with something that could have been disbelief or perhaps realization as the full weight of Poirot's words began to sink in. Durand, who had been standing near the window, looked down, his shoulders heavy, with guilt for his part in the cover-up. "The story," Poirot said, turning to face the Colonel, "is as follows. Colonel Carlyle, faced with a pressing financial situation and a need to preserve his family's legacy, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. You see, he struck a deal with Captain Westfield, or rather, with the man who would become Captain Westfield, to substitute him for another soldier, someone who would die in his place, leaving no trace of the truth behind. And when the time came to send that body back to England, Carlyle knew that he could keep the secret safe, claim the fortune meant for Westfield, and continue with his life, none the wiser." The room grew colder, and Poirot's voice dropped, his words taking on an almost chilling finality. But Carlyle underestimated the man he thought was a mere pawn in his scheme. Westfield did not die that day. He was, in fact, taken prisoner, but before he could be interrogated, He escaped, leaving Carlyle with the terrible burden of his deception. The Colonel's lips parted, but he said nothing. His face had turned pale, and his gaze dropped to the floor, as if he could no longer meet the eyes of those he had deceived. Westfield, alive and furious at the betrayal, returned to expose the truth. He knew that Carlyle had orchestrated the switch and that the body sent home was not his. But Westfield did not return to seek vengeance. He returned to right the wrongs, to reveal the deceit for what it was. Poirot paused, letting the room absorb his words. The pieces had finally fallen into place. The soldier who had returned from the dead was not a figure of vengeance or anger. He had come back to set the record straight, to clear his name, and to expose the machinations of the man who had sentenced him to death twice over. But the twist, the final stroke of the Colonel's cleverness, was in his own plan to use Westfield's return as a smokescreen, Poirot said. You see, Carlyle thought that by allowing Westfield to be resurrected, he could play the hero, cover up the murder, and shift the suspicion away from himself. He assumed that no one would dare question the return of a dead man, that it would be an impossible feat to unravel. But I did. The shock on the faces of the others in the room was palpable. Mrs. Westfield, her hand trembling as she reached for a glass of water, stared at Carlyle as though she were seeing him for the first time. Durand, the one person who had known the Colonel's true nature, still looked uncomfortable, but now there was a faint glimmer of guilt in his eyes, perhaps for the part he had played in maintaining the lie. "You were very clever, Colonel," Poirot continued, "but not clever enough. In your desperation you failed to account for one thing. My little grey cells, mon ami. They always find the answer." The Colonel's expression faltered, his composure cracking at last. He looked up at Poirot, his eyes filled with an unreadable mixture of anger and fear. The facade of the military man, the pillar of the community, was gone now. All that was left was a broken man, guilty of 2 murders, the first of a soldier who had never deserved to die, and the second of the very man who had once been his comrade. Poirot gave a slight nod to Durand, who stepped forward, visibly shaken. "The truth, Colonel, is that you killed 2 men. One was a death of circumstance, but the second was cold, deliberate. And it is that second death, the one that followed you into the shadows, that I have brought to light." Colonel Carlyle's shoulders slumped in defeat, and he lowered his head as though the weight of his actions had finally overwhelmed him. I did it for my family," he whispered hoarsely. "For the estate. For the legacy. But you destroyed it all with your greed and your lies," Poirot responded, his voice unwavering. "And now you must face the consequences." There was a long silence in the room, broken only by the soft rustling of the curtains in the breeze. Poirot's gaze swept over the faces of those gathered, and as he turned toward the door, he gave his final signature line. "Justice, it seems, has been served. My little grey cells, mon ami, have led me to the truth." As he left the room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors, the room was left in stunned silence. The mystery had been solved, but the consequences of that truth would linger for much longer.